input shaft, right? And it's pressed against that front bearing retainer, which is a wear device, by the way, right? It's a functioning device. If you pull that throwout bearing into that clutch brake and sandwich it, because you know the throwout bearing's not rotating. You know, the casting's not. The bearing might be on the inside, but the casting's not. You sandwich that clutch brake in between the throwout bearing and the front bearing retainer, you have the ability to slow down the input shaft, because really what you're doing is slowing down the counter shafts, because that's what's being driven by the main drive gear. Now, if you stop the counter shafts, you can then switch gears or directions, right? From first to reverse, reverse to first. And that's the only time you need the thing. But it's pretty important, ain't it? Right? Because you know when you cannot get clutch brake squeeze, things are bad, right? Shut the truck off, throw it in gear, right? Turn it back on, take off. It'll irritate you to death. You've got to have this function. It's a big deal. So that's the basis of why they built this thing. So now, some of the basics. If you look in the Eaton manual, if you look in our manual, the manuals always say, when this clutch is bolted up, we want to obtain a ½ inch gap between the front, basically the clutch brake and the front bearing retainer. That's our main goal, right? And really the Spicer manual says between 1/2 and 9/16. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect. It's just got to have it's got a window where it works, right? It says you need that between 1/2 and 9/16. Now what's interesting about that is that's a very standard dimension, and some clutches you buy would even say in the box or on the box, this clutch has been pre-adjusted. Anybody ever see that? This clutch has been adjusted. I didn't understand what they meant by that. Well, the fact of it is, there's a standard envelope that we have to deal with. If you look at the center line, if you look at the center line of that cross shaft bushing hole, right, to the face of that flywheel, that dimension is standard. Which is why transmissions are interchangeable, right? You can take a Rockwell out, you can put an Eaton in, right? Because typically you won't take an Eaton out and put a Rockwell in, right? Hopefully not. Well, you could, right? Or you could take a Spicer out, right? Like a 1010, right? You can put in a Fuller, because that dimension is just universal, right? So what I finally determined, if that was standard, if everything was standard, and they said these things were pre-adjusted, I said, what are they adjusted to? Well, because Eaton, Dana, knew this window of opportunity we had to work with. There's a standard stack height that we work with in the industry, and when this clutch is bolted to the flywheel with the discs and intermediate plate in place, bolted, this dimension from the face of the throwout bearing to the flywheel is 7.22. That is the standard stack height. They knew that because of the window we had to work with, which is why what they say in this manual is if everything is perfect, if this clutch is set at exactly 7.22 when we assemble it, when you bolt it to the flywheel and you stab your transmission with your standard clutch brake in place, which by the way, clutch brakes have a standard thickness, 3/8 of an inch, right? In this assembly, you will have exactly 1/2 to 9/16 of an inch gap. Okay, that's what they mean by pre-adjusted, right? So at least now I started to better understand why in the world these things made sense, or why they had to be. Another question I had was, why a 1/2 inch, right? Why was the 1/2 inch so important? Basically, this throwout bearing pull has two functions, right? One part of the pull is to get release. You got to get the pressure plate off the disc so they float on the input shaft so you can disconnect it from the flywheel, right? That's what you got to have, okay? Obviously, we don't, if that's what we're trying to accomplish, we don't want to engage the clutch brake, right? Because we only want to engage the clutch brake whenever we're changing directions, right? That's the only time we want to touch it. So that means this gap, this 1/2 inch, has two purposes. It takes a minimum of 3/8 of an inch to release this clutch. These levers that connect the collar to the pressure plate are 10-to-1. Okay? So basically 3/8 of an inch gives us 30 thousandths clearance at the discs. That's minimum, right? So now, with the way they designed the clutch, you can get 3/8 of an inch pull, get full release without touching the clutch brake. if you started off with less than a half, right? See what could happen? You could engage the clutch brake before you got release, which is why the half is so important. So now, to me, that made sense. The other dimension that they give us is this 1/8 of an inch, right? They say you need approximately an 1/8 of an inch gap between the fork and the throwout bearing. I didn't know why. It just said it, right? It just said that's what you want. Well, the fact of it is, that gap, right, if you look at your linkage to your pedal, right, that's your pedal free play, right? Because you got that little, of like the 10 inches of throw you get at a pedal, that first 1.5 to 2 inches is your pedal free plate. That's just the gap you have so that you know that the fork isn't touching the throwout bearing. The meat of the throw is your 3/8 of an inch pull on the throwout bearing. The bottom of it is your clutch brake squeeze. So that's the 3 dimensions you have of your pedal. Not a big deal, it's just kind of basic, right? But the fact of it is, these things started to become important because that 1/8 of an inch gap that you started with won't always be there, right? Okay, because as these components wear, right, you apply and release, what happens to your components? They wear, they get thinner, your throwout bearing moves closer to the flywheel. This gap grows, right? This gap decreases. What's neat about the way they designed the clutch is it has a built-in wear indicator, right? Your wear indicator is your pedal free play, because you always tell the drivers, right, come in for a clutch adjustment before you reach 0. That's just kind of basic. It doesn't always happen, right? Trying to make it back, whatever. Because you know what happens now, as you continue to wear components, and if you allow this throwout bearing to rest on the fork, what happens to your torque capacity? Drops off, then you can start slipping, right? Or you can get it so far away that you can't get clutch brake squeeze, right? Just as bad. Which is why we tell people, you know, we need to readjust the clutch, right, before you hit the 0. Well, that was my other question. Okay, what about this adjustment thing, right? How much can you adjust, right? What do you get out of this thing? Well, first of all, what I want to do is kind of show you real quick. If you look at the way they put this ring in to the cover assembly, right? You know it's threaded into the cover, right? It's threaded into the cover. Those levers, we've all seen the levers in that clutch, right? If you've taken one of our remans or a spicer out, and you see those levers, right? Well, what's interesting about those is the way they put them in this clutch. There's a hook lever on the ring, and that's what the levers kind of basically hook into. And then there's this bump out. This bump out is what actually touches the pressure plate. The other end of it is attached to the collar assembly, right? It's just in a groove. So now you can see if you pull this collar back, right, you will lift the lever off of the pressure plate, right? Remember back in the day when you used to buy clutches that had the 4 little external springs on them, right? So after you pulled the throwout bearing up, lifted the levers off of the pressure plate, the little return springs would pull the pressure plate up, right? Because the levers wouldn't pull it up, it would just take the pressure off of it, because your springs, your power springs, are piloted in the upper casting of the clutch, but rest on the bottom of the throwout bearing collar, right? And that's how we push the levers down to give us our plate lift. Now what's interesting about that is the way this ring works, right? Because you know you can compensate for wear with the ring. Well, if you look at it, it's threaded. When it's new, it's threaded all the way into, almost all the way into the top of the cover. As you adjust it, you push the ring outward towards the flywheel. What's interesting about this lever is it's actually like a teeter-totter, right? If you push the ring out, it shoves this in that way. You with me? Which is why when you make a threaded adjustment, right, when you spin this ring out, you actually shove the throwout bearing back out. Of course, that's how we compensate for material wear. Because basically what happens is, as we apply and release, we use up components, it's thinner, the pressure plate goes further forward, the throwout bearing goes further forward, we increase our gap, eventually we eliminate our 1/8 inch, right? And eventually we have to compensate for that. Spicer gave us the ability with this ring, you just thread it out, right? So now, as long as because you know the deal, you can't turn this ring unless you take the pressure off of it, which is why you got to have somebody in the cab or something holding the pedal down, right? You got to pull the throw bearing back to make your ring adjustment because it's directly attached to the springs and the pressure plate. Then you can make your adjustment. Well, then I asked the question, how much can you adjust, right? And then somebody told me, until you thread it out, dummy. Okay, that didn't help. How many adjustments do you get? I didn't know. So here's the drill. We already said that this lever is a 10-to-1 ratio, right? We already said that this basic gap, I'm just going to say basic, is 1/8 of an inch between the throw bearing and the fork. Spicer says that we have the ability with this ring to adjust for 1/100,000ths of component wear. That's all they give us. If you allow the components to wear any more, they start touching. Right? If you stack up the 2 discs on the intermediate plate, you'll notice there's not a humongous gap between those 2 hubs. There's also not a huge gap between the hub and the throw-out bearing collar, right? And you can only wear so much before things start touching. So, knowing that you can only compensate for 100,000ths of component wear, all right? That's 100,000ths here. This lever's 10-to-1. Equals 1 inch. We're basically making adjustments in around 1/8 inch increments. Not exactly right, because you're not only always going to have exactly an 1/8 inch gap to give you your pedal free play. Some people want more pedal free play, right? Some people want less. It depends on what your gap is, right? But just for generics, right? If we're making adjustments in 1/8 inch increments and we can only compensate for 1 inch of component travel, how many adjustments do I get? 8. Right? Okay, so it really should be like 10 to 12 because you should be adjusting before you actually touch, right? Now, that's when everything is brand new, right? Everything is wonderful at this point because we had just bought this truck and or we had just put this transmission in. The gap was identical. The clutch was already pre-adjusted at 7.22. I didn't have to make any adjustment when I put the thing in. Right, that never happens. But anyway, right? Never had to touch it. Everything is good. I get the full adjustable life out of this clutch. What happens as the truck ages, right? And you do clutch jobs. Right? So now let's think about that. What do we do when we turn the flywheel? So now we're going to take thousands off of this flywheel, right? And I mean, you guys have seen some of these flywheels get trenched bad, right? By buttons. You know, some people slip them more than others. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but sometimes you can see a flywheel that's got like an 1/8 inch divot in it. And you got to take that out, right? You got to clean it up. So now we take out all of this meat. So what happens is now we bolt this clutch to the flywheel. And remember, it's pre-adjusted to 7.22, right? But now I bolt this clutch in here. Guess what? My gap is beyond 9/16. It's at 7/8, right? The gap is too large. What does Spicer tell you to do to compensate for that? I like that. They would hate it if you heard that. That's my rule. Their rule says make a clutch adjustment. That's what they made it for, right? Well, that's fine. That's what they say to do. If your gap, and it's right in their manual, and what's neat is I have a copy of this, they put it right in their manual. When you're setting it up, easy pedal only. If the measurement was more than 0.56, which is 9/16, right, during installation, turn the adjusting nut clockwise, right? Compensate for it. That's the way it's designed. Not a big deal, right? So I make a clutch adjustment. What did you just do?
Shorten the life of the clutch.
Yeah. By how much? Just depends on how much you had to adjust it, right? Or it depends on how many times the flywheel's been turned. It just depends. Some people ask, well, how long do the flywheels last? Well, I don't know, right? Depends on what kind of a trench you had in it, how much you had to clean it up, right? As to how much compensation you have to give to it. It's not the only wear component we have to overcome that makes this gap. Remember I said there's another piece in this that will directly affect that 1/2 inch gap. It's not just a flywheel. What's the other piece we have?
The front of the training.
Yeah, the front bearing retainer. How many of you have seen a lip worn in those things? Right? It's a wear device. It's a wear item. right? So here's the thing that'll kill you.